Village Homes was probably one of the first neighbourhoods to retain all of its rainwater on the site. That nowadays is sort of something that we ask for in building code, but back then that was not how things worked. Most rain that fell would go into storm drains and then be pushed out into channels or elsewhere. Every drop of rainwater that falls in Village Homes stays in Village Homes and is percolated back down into the soil in order to nurture the fruit trees and grow things in that neighbourhood too. And that system of swales and basins that collects that water was pretty unique at the time. And a lot of people think of Village Homes as a solar community. In fact, it's been named America's first solar community. But in fact, it's also really America's first natural, sort of urban watershed.
Imagine a place that checks nearly every box in the search for utopia. Sustainable, communal, safe, and all of those things to the nth degree. Now imagine that place at 50 years old and you've just imagined Village Homes. Today's guest, Tim McNeil, is not only one of the foremost experts in that community, he's also a resident. Stick around, it's going to be a great conversation. So I want to talk a little bit about this development, this Village Homes installation. Can you give us a little bit about the history?
So Village Homes was, the ground broke on Village Homes in 1975. So it's 50 years. In August, actually, was the 50th anniversary. The history goes back longer than that because the developers, Michael and Judy Corbett, were thinking about developing this community, this sustainable community, I would say 5 to 7 years before that. They were dreaming up an idea about how to create sort of their ideal, I don't want to say utopian, but in some ways it was a utopian suburb, what they and their friends where they would like to live and how they'd like it to function. So the history, basically starts off with them meeting with their friends and deciding to build an intentional community, which, then played itself out. But before they could even get to the point of breaking ground, there's a big chunk of time, or several years, a few years, when they really had to battle with the city of Davis to get approval for what was a pretty radical idea for a suburb here in Davis.
So, but back in those days, in '75, when was that when construction began, or that's not when the project was conceived, right? It was actually built and launched by '75.
Well, the first shovel in the ground was in 1975.
Okay.
So prior to that, for a few years, there was a lot of back and forth with the city over getting permits and approvals to build the neighborhood. So the sequence of events was essentially, Michael and Judy Corbett coming together, coming up with this idea, and then really having to sort of very doggedly work in some ways against the city of Davis to get this approved, because the city of Davis saw it didn't meet city code at that time. The things they were proposing to do were not what the city was used to doing. It was something different.
So back in those days, in the 70s, there was a lot of inertia around the green philosophy, the emerging green philosophy, the ecology movement and things like that. I guess Earth Day had happened a couple of years since 1970, I think.
Yep.
So it kind of rode that wave. Do you feel like that motion kind of created a political will among the people and among those authorities in Davis who would say yay or nay?
It did, and there's a story there about how the city came to approve it. And just interestingly, you said that about Earth Day. Mike and Judy actually tabled at the first Earth Day at UC Davis, the one in 1970, the Whole Earth Festival, actually, and were pitching this idea. They were trying to get people to join them and to think about, well, okay, if we built this intentional, sustainable community, who would like to be part of it? How would we launch it? What sort of ideas? So they were kind of getting feedback. So that's a nice tie-in, right? Because that's exactly when we start thinking about this movement, the sustainability movement, this sort of eco-movement of that time. But really the origins go more back to the 60s, right? When there were a thought about, it was during the Vietnam War, There was a pushback against government at that time, what was going on. There was the energy crisis happening in the United States. And so it was against a backdrop of that and a more radical and progressive way of thinking about things, and a pushback against conformity and sort of the sort of trappings of society, and particularly suburbia, which during the sort of rise of suburbia in the 50s and 60s was always sort of meant to be a sort of utopian thing, right? You'd have your own house, you'd have a car, you'd have your parking garage, you'd live within reasonable distance of your work. But that wasn't for everybody, and that dream didn't necessarily pan out for many people either. It was the sort of a loss of connection, maybe because people were moving out of the cities. There was a loss of connection to nature because these were quite big sprawling neighborhoods that were being designed. And the other big thing was a loss of community, where people would basically drive into their house, into their parking garage, into their garage, get out of the car in the house and never see any of their neighbors. So what Michael and Judy were doing was pushing back against some of this. Like them and their friends, I mean, they would have been in their 20s at this time. Judy was a graduate student at UC Davis. Mike had just finished a degree in architecture at San Luis Obispo. So they were riding that wave. They were thinking, okay, we want to do something different. This isn't working for us, and we want to make a change. That change only came about, well, there are several reasons, but one of the big ones was that what they wanted to do was so radical, really, at the time, that the city of Davis, as I mentioned, were sort of almost locked into a way of doing things. Like, well, we do it this way, we build roads this way, we build communities this way, we build houses this way. What Mike and Judy were proposing went against many of those things. And if we kind of look back on it, what they were proposing back then, we somewhat take for granted now. Open space, smaller roads, pathways maybe in our communities. There are things, or trees, or greenery. But back then, that wasn't necessarily the way things were done. And so it took a while, their process of working with the city was convoluted and took time. So they had to be very patient, and there were moments when they nearly gave up on it as well.
I can imagine from a legalistic standpoint, again, given the temperature of what was happening back in the 70s, we're not far from Berkeley, there's a lot of eruption and potential eruption, and just, like no one wants to be thought of as the enemy, and to squash something that is so noble in its inception. It seems, I can imagine like somebody in City Hall going, let's talk, yesterday, or, in like 67 or 68, this would never have flown. But now I'm on your side, I'm one of you hip kids or whatever. And their 20s must have been really an infectious amount of energy coming from them as well. So I would talk a little bit about what was at the time an aspirational community, and still to this day, 50 years later, has a lot of aspirational qualities that a lot of neighborhoods just don't seem to be able to achieve. Like communities that have been built around this, what is utopian, dream kind of philosophy. People tried and they failed. What makes this so special?
I mean, imagine a neighborhood you're living in where about at least 50% of the land is given over to common area. So park, greenland space, green belts essentially, so that you're surrounded by trees and by nature. Imagine a place where you can literally walk down a street and pick fruit off the trees, and it's all seasonal, so all year round there is something to be harvested essentially, whether that's stone fruit in the spring, to peaches and nectarines in the summer, to pomegranates moving into the fall and the winter. And so imagine this sort of edible landscape, as it's called. Also, where there are places where you can grow your own food, so you can almost be pretty self-sufficient in terms of food production. Imagine a place where you would bump into your neighbors on a regular basis. You would see them from your house. You would wave to them. You wouldn't necessarily be able to escape them, which isn't for everybody, but here is a chance that you can at least see who's around you and to some degree feel a sense of security around that too, because the visibility in your neighborhood is pretty high. Imagine a place where your children can run free. They can inhabit a space that is safe, a place where they can climb trees, they can crawl through ditches, they can also get up to mischief in a good way as well, but also a place where, they learn through being outside and, more importantly, run into their friends who also live in that neighborhood too, without a huge amount of parental supervision. Like, it's a more natural way of just a neighbor of bumping into your friends and, hey, let's go and do something fun together. Imagine a place where, the community is connected by multiple pathways and bikeways that are not car-centric. This is a place where you can walk everywhere, you can cycle everywhere. In fact, it's a community that downplays the vehicle. It encourages people to park them off the streets. So again, the street doesn't become a place that is, heavily automobile orientated. Imagine a place where the houses that are in there are, very energy efficient and using passive solar within those houses to keep your house naturally heated and cooled, so your energy bills are less. This is a sort of almost sounds like an idyllic kind of landscape and place to be, but it really isn't that difficult to accomplish or achieve. So at the time, it's not that we couldn't do it again today, but there has to be a will, and there would have to be some sacrifices made by everyone involved to make that happen in the same way. So it's just setting the sort of scene of what this place is like.
Yeah, I am familiar enough with the development to know that when I hear about it, it always comes through that lens of the infrastructural. Like the homes are energy efficient. They were among the first in the country to be, passive solar powered. The water system, the gray water system, is very, even by today's standards, is pretty advanced, and something that has been used sparingly, and no one can really figure out why. Like in those regards, community is clearly really well ahead of its time. But you touched on something. As a matter of fact, you emphasized that you started with it and you built a long story around the social benefits of this that are something that you see a lot in Europe. Like, there are those common areas where people gather. And I think we've spoken before, the way you contextualized it as you walk out your front door and there's your neighbors. You want to get away from your neighbors, you've got a backyard that affords you that kind of privacy, which is pretty wonderful. But it's that, we gather around fruit, around, communal food. We gather around communal water, because it is a communal water system, right?
Yeah, there's that's one other thing that I should mention is that Village Homes was probably one of the first neighborhoods to retain all of its rainwater on the site. That nowadays is sort of something that we ask for in building code, but back then that was not how things worked. Most rain that fell would go into storm drains and then be pushed out into channels or elsewhere. Every drop of rainwater that falls in Village Homes stays in Village Homes and is percolated back down into the soil in order to nurture the fruit trees and grow things in that neighborhood too. And that system of swales and basins that collects that water was pretty unique at the time. And a lot of people think of Village Homes as a solar community. In fact, it's been named America's first solar community. But in fact, it's also really America's first natural or sort of urban watershed, where, a lot of thought was given to how water would be managed on the site, and everything would then be used to help replenish the soil and grow food and, make the place a better place to be.
That's incredible, and I'm not surprised that it got the attention that it did back. It might have been like a perfect storm, because like the clearly solid, very progressive ideas that are brought forth by very energetic and accomplished people who are looking at a long-term solution, like a model that could be replicated across the country or around the world. Then they're borrowing from some of the better existing cultures in the world. You know, the whole communal aspect of a lot of European cities, with that kind of bucolic, suburban, or even ex-urban kind of a vibe to it. But some of the people who have visited this over time, like Rosalynn Carter has come. I know you weren't there back in those days, but you are a resident, right? To be clear.
I am, yes.
Okay, but the list of dignitaries that have visited this place to study it, to celebrate it, to advocate for this kind of philosophy. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, certainly. And I think also, just to back up on what you said about inspiration from Europe, I mean, Michael Corbett, the main developer for Village Homes, was very influenced by the Garden City movement, which principally happened in Europe, and particularly in the UK. And the idea of building communities that had a lot of green open space and a chance for people to grow their own food. So those European ideas were certainly channeled to Village Homes in that way. Village Homes was a magnet for many people once word got out. It got a lot of publicity, it got featured in a lot of media, and as a result, there were a lot of tours that happened. In fact, residents would actually set up a whole committee just to lead tours through the community. And for some would actually charge money for it. That doesn't happen anymore, but it was almost became quite philanthropic in a way, because so many people wanted to come there. There are actually quite a lot of very funny stories because, again, going back to the fact, as you were saying, about public versus private, that there is as you said, a private space at the back of houses, but the front looks onto a common area. So these common areas are shared by clusters of houses. But it also means there are no fences in this community. It's almost like one open public space to some degree. So in the early days, before any of the vegetation had matured or the landscape had come in, things that you can imagine were very open. So you would have these tour groups going through, and literally some people would just walk into people's houses, not knowing where the boundary between public and private space was, which I think, is interesting that even people visiting didn't quite know where they could and couldn't go because the sort of boundary was still sort of diffuse in that way. But yes, it attracted a lot of attention. Rosalynn Carter visited. I believe it was 1978, and toured Village Homes at that time to see what this community was all about. At that time, the Carter administration was very interested in energy efficiency and how to create more sustainable communities and neighborhoods. Probably one of the biggest impact visits was by the then French President Francois Mitterand, who flew in by helicopter there were 3 helicopters actually that landed on what's called the Big Green or Parque Grande, which is a large open common area within the community. So you can imagine these 3 helicopters descending, and the security that was all there too, and that all of the villagers in the community and people in the community of Davis came to see this happen. It would have been quite a sight, all with their French flags waving as well. And then the president toured around the community before getting in the helicopter and heading off. And in fact, a funny side story is there on the Big Green there is a gazebo structure which was built to sort of for people to leave food, to trade food essentially within the community. So if you had too much of a certain food type, you would trade it with somebody else. And the gazebo structure had a canvas canopy on top of it, which was just tethered down just to protect it from rain and give it some kind of sense of a covering. But when Mitterrand's helicopter landed, the rotor blades and the wind was so strong that it literally lifted this canopy off. There's actually a photograph of it flying through the air. Anyway, so these visits were became quite infamous for some of the things that happened at the same time too. Jane Fonda visited a few times, was very interested in particularly in what Michael Corbett was proposing and the houses that he had designed, and indeed asked Mike to design her house in Santa Monica in Southern California. The musician Pete Seeger played there. Was very interested in that community and what it stood for as well. It had many other people from all over the world who visited it on and off over the years.
And I have to think, just the ripples from those few stones. Like Jimmy Carter put solar panels on the White House, first president to do that, and they were immediately removed by Ronald Reagan at the transition. But his heart was in the right place. Who knows if this inspired that? And also, the Paris Accords, the Paris Climate Accords, maybe they got the idea from there. I'm just saying. I have no idea about the actual history of the Paris Accords, and I'm happy for our audience to correct me or don't, because let me own this dream for a little bit. I want to believe that we informed that. But one of the things that I think was kind of a shock to me when I saw the layout, there's an image that builds in your head when you think about this. When I say like an ecological community, or a community that is built upon sustainability, like energy efficiency and communal interaction, and you kind of get this visual in your head of like small homes, like small, like shires, like Hobbit shires, which I know that a lot of the streets are named after roads or elements in
the streets are all named after locations in Lord of the Rings.
Which is kind of kitschy. But if you hear all those facts without ever having seen this place, you kind of, to me at least, I had a very specific visual of what it looked like. I was blown away to see the size of the homes. Mm-hmm. They are not. They're not. They're California modest. They're perfectly adequate for even contemporary California homes. The size of the lots, the organizational structure of the community is tight. It's registered. Like there are things everything in its place, and a place for everything, kind of a thing. It's not this hippie commune that I was expecting, like a tent city kind of a thing, right. Like that kind of vibe. Can you talk a little bit about the philosophy behind that?
Yeah, and I also, going back before we get there, because you mentioned about tent city, and I think it's important to note that when Mike and Judy were conceiving of village homes in the early days, and the group of people they were working with, they had a split within their working group where one half of the group were more interested in developing an intentional off-the-grid community elsewhere that was more removed from an urban city or outside of the sort of urban structure or infrastructure. Mike and Judy were very intentional that they wanted to build their community in a city and remain plugged in and connected. Like they wanted to make sure the people who were living there had jobs, that they were able to take advantage of what cities offer, and indeed all the amenities they offer too. So they weren't interested in going back to the land and dropping out. They really wanted to do that same thing in more of an adult kind of grown-up way. And I think that's interesting because, some of the first residents were young professionals who were teachers, or other people working here in Davis or elsewhere. And that, again, was important to them, that they were helping people get their first homes and were offering homes that were actually quite small originally, maybe about 1,200 to 1,600 square feet, as starter homes for people and offering them at a fairly good price. Mike Corbett, who designed many of the homes, was not interested in luxury type homes. They're quite simple. They're not basic. They have everything you need, but then, he wasn't interested in doing something, like a really fancy kind of suburb. He wanted to keep it quite simple. But he also wanted people to be able to customize or build on their own homes over time, so that this was the starting point. Indeed, many of the homes that are there now have been remodeled or had additions put on them. So you're seeing, the evolution of that community over time as people have had families and the houses had to grow with them. And many people, once they move into village homes, never want to leave. So they want to bring their children up there or raise their families there, and indeed stay there when they reach retirement or get older as well, because it's truly a multi-generational community in that sense. So, yeah.
And there is a waiting list to get in, right?
There is, in the sense that people have their names down with realtors in the city of Davis, yes, waiting for those houses to come up. Yeah, yeah. So it is a very desirable neighborhood to be in. But the houses themselves, so they've kind of grown. But initially, yes, they're not small, as you say, Hobbit-style homes. They're perfectly adequate, for a family, or at least have grown with them. But the other interesting thing is actually, if you look at the plan of the houses on the site, they're actually quite close together. It doesn't really feel like that because they're close together on the sort of east and west, as it were, but the north and south have the space, because that's where, going back to the passive solar idea, all the houses are orientated north-south. So you're taking advantage of the low winter sun during in the winter to warm the house, and then also with the way that houses are designed, they shade the house so that you protect it from the high summer sun. So the basic passive solar orientation is at play there. But they're also on these smaller lots to basically give much more space over to common land. And this is, where the orchards are, where the community can come together and congregate in these common areas. So that changes the very nature of how the sort of layout of the houses are as well.
And amidst those communal spaces where fruit is grown, someone could plant their own, correct?
Yes, they could. In fact, the initial idea, and it still plays out pretty much true today, and this was Judy Corbett's vision. Judy was very influenced by former professor here at UC Davis, Robert Summer. And Bob Summer was a professor of psychology who was very interested in the psychology of space and how people inhabit space and work together. And Judy took classes with Bob Summer and learnt through those classes that the ideal kind of group of people to make decisions is 8. That's enough kind of to not be too many, but not to be too few to come to consensus. So the community was actually built around clusters of 8 houses with a shared common area between them. So each of those 8 houses was then given the opportunity to program their own common area. So again, Mike Corbett was giving up this space to the residents and saying, I'm not going to develop it for you, I'm going to let you do it and decide what you want to do. And that, of course, took many different shapes and forms depending on the 8 people living, or the 8 groups living in those houses. But many of them, yes, planted gardens, planted orchards, developed play structures for children, had barbecue pits and things built. So there was this sense again of ownership, that you could create your own space and therefore own it and be more incentivized to take care of it and, to sort of nurture it over time as well.
So we, the 8, are the controlling group as far as the decision makers of how this land is treated, but the land is still, whatever we decide to put there is open to all still?
It's still open to people to come visit and, of course, come and spend time there, absolutely. And it's, some people within the community have done different things with their common areas. Some of them are still very open and collective. Others have become more private. It just depends on, I think it's really important to think about village homes as an experiment. I see it as it's a radical experiment in community living, and that experiment involved trying things out, like can groups of neighbors come together and program their own public open space. Sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't, and so it's kind of the whole place is sort of is a living example of trying these things out and seeing what works and what doesn't to varying degrees.
But there is an element of governance in here, right? There's a homeowners association. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about what's the percentage of people who belong to the homeowners association? Is everybody part of it, and what are the decision making, the voting process like?
Yeah. Yes, there's a homeowners association. Everyone belongs to that. Every resident there is part of that collective. There are several committees that are made up of volunteers, of residents, and there is a board which consists of about 5 to 6 people, and a president of that board, which is elected every 3 years. So they're making the bigger decisions, but there are open community meetings where everyone can participate to weigh in on decisions that are having to be made, or at least have their voice heard to that degree. Each of the common areas themselves, those houses still have autonomy over those areas. I mean, that's their decision to decide what they wish to do. But it's quite unusual, again, looking back on when it was first conceived and developed, again, going back to what Mike and Judy were doing, giving up so much land to the residents rather than feeling that as a developer they could develop more houses. They could have done that. They could have also controlled it much more. They could have decided, well, we're going to design all the houses, we're going to create all the landscape, and we're not going to let people do that part of it. But they really had a very open-ended approach of letting the community take charge in that sense.
And I have to think that there are going to be people for whom this model is just absolutely not attractive at all. Uh-huh. There are people, and I know quite a few of them, who are, I know I need at least 6,000 square feet, and I need a pool, and I need a laundry list of things that it's almost like I am planning for the apocalypse. I like a staycation in the apocalypse kind of a thing. I need to make sure that I have distractions around me, and I'm going to care for me and my family, and that's about it. Have you seen people of that mindset experience this neighborhood and say, I get it. I see the appeal? Because I mean, I think for a while the younger version of me tended to be that, you get the aspirations, your career's starting to take off. You start to think about, I got to get stuff. Or what does my house look like? I need a pool or whatever. Yeah. I never got a pool. I've never earned enough money for one, but anyway, that's my sob story. But I have since come around to where I've traveled. I've gone to Europe and I've experienced that connectivity that I'm just so envious of. And when I come back to the United States, I look for it and I can't find it anywhere. It sounds like it's kind of here. Have you seen people swayed by this model?
Yeah, and also the opposite, where I think people have looked at it and decided, it's not for me. And it's not for everybody, And I think there's also a little bit of a misconception out there. Village homes has been called Hobbitville, or different those hippies living over there, whatever it might be, and it really isn't that at all. And this sense of they're sort of the main thing people think. There's no fences, right? Everything's going to be completely out in the open. But when you visit there, you realize that really isn't part of it at all. Like, the idea of having these shared spaces doesn't mean to say you have to give up your privacy. All it's doing is giving you more reasons to connect with your neighbors, essentially, and making that much easier to happen. You can still retreat into your home or into your backyard if you wish to. You don't have to participate in everything. And indeed, not all the residents do. I mean, there are work parties, at least one or two a month where people come together, and this weekend there's going to be an olive harvest. So a group of people will harvest the olive trees, and they will then be sent off to make olive oil, and then we'll get olive oil for those of us who participate. But not everyone's going to do that, and that's okay. So there is a certain commitment to living there, but I think it's on a varying scale. Like, you can decide to be full into it, or you can decide to sit back, just depending on who you are. But I do feel that there are some people who've been won over, like, I wasn't sure about this, but now I'm a believer. And are those people who maybe bought there and said, that really isn't for me. I want a bigger house, and I want to be somewhere else. And of course, that's okay too. For some reason, my mind went into a Halloween space, because when you're referring to it as a Shire, I'm thinking, does everybody dress as Frodo or Bilbo or Gandalf or somebody? People name them dogs after them. Some dog called Frodo.
That's great. It must get confusing though. Like Gandalf and 15 dogs show up. Can we talk a little bit about the tech aspect? The sociological components of this are just mind-bending. I mean, I think in that regard, it is an experiment that I would love to have watched over time and see evolve. But the nerd part of me, the tech nerd part of me, loves the fact that the quotient of sustainability in this community is so high. How is that managed over time? Because the technology continues to improve. Or is there a committee amongst homeowners association that says we're going to upgrade? Be prepared. We got to do a communal thing, or we're going to install windmills or something like that. How does that work? How do you keep up with the times?
Great question. And I think this is very much a moment in time. We're talking about 50 years since the building of village homes, and we're a little bit of a junction point. Because a lot of the fruit trees and trees that were planted are now reaching the end of their life, or at least we have to think about how to replace those so that they don't all eventually die and we have no trees. So there's quite a lot of thinking at the moment about planting young trees now before the mature trees eventually die. So there is always having to think ahead, like think about the long term. And you mentioned the technology. Probably the most technological aspect of the community is the passive solar in all the housing. So just to kind of back up on that, every house in village homes incorporates passive solar. And as I mentioned, it's this north-south orientation of having very few windows on the east and west facing, where you get the lowest sun rising, sun setting, and the most intense heat, and putting most of your windows on the north and on the south to take advantage of the low sun in the winter. And then, of course, the north is often always shaded. That's sort of the benchmark for every home. Nearly every house also had solar collectors, which are basically tanks on the roof to heat water. So water would be pumped into these tanks and heated by the sun, and that would be used in the house for washing, for laundry, whatever it might be, or stored in your regular water tank, water heater, and then distributed as needed. So that was a baseline pretty much for every single house too. Then there was a variety of other options, some of which were to do more with increasing the thermal mass within the houses. So thermal mass being, what absorbs heat and what absorbs cold to keep the temperature regulated within a structure. So all houses have thermal mass. Your roof, your walls, your floor are all thermal mass. They're all getting hotter, they're all getting colder as the sun gets on them at different times of day. But you can modulate that by putting in other structures. And in the case of village homes, it was big tanks of water, like containers of water. And these were installed in a variety of different ways. Some were in pipes that were in front of windows, so they would absorb the sun, warm up, and then release that heat during the cooler nights. Some were in the center of the home, where they would collect it more from all around the space and then diffuse it within the home. Some were more strategically placed, in other parts of the house. But this idea of thermal mass and experimenting with that was a big thing in village homes, and it was riding a wave, as we were talking about earlier, of innovation around solar technology in the late 60s and early 70s, realizing that we had to find alternative uses or ways of producing energy, right? With an energy crisis, many people were looking, and Mike Corbett in particular, what would a sort of post-petroleum future look like? And indeed, Mike's initiative was to build a solar community. That was probably the first thing that he was really interested in doing, was how do we develop a community that can be completely either energy independent, but more so just incredibly energy efficient. And if you go back to everything in village homes, it is really about energy, because not only about maximizing the passive and active solar within the houses, but also growing your own food means you don't have to drive anywhere to pick it up, right? You've got everything there, so you're not using energy to do that. Reclaiming and keeping all of your water means you're not pumping it somewhere else and having to maintain it in a sewer system or something like that. Making it a place that people want to hang out and spend time together in that community and not necessarily travel other places, again, saving energy. And I kind of see that that's the heart of everything in some ways, that it was really driven by this sort of heightened sense of energy conservation in the late 60s and early 70s, going back to that mood and that vibe of that time. So the technology side of it was pretty sophisticated at the time. These passive solar systems were not complicated. They used everyday materials, pipes, water tanks. You could buy stuff in the hardware store. And that was intentional too. And we can kind of go back and look at the Whole Earth Catalog and what was happening, which was produced basically in the late 60s and into the early 70s as a DIY. How can you build your own solar oven? How can you, grow food in better ways? So this was all tapping into that ethos too. And the idea that you could build your own passive solar system, we're using quite simple materials, was definitely something that, Mike was advocating for. And many of the people who bought land and then either bought one of Mike's houses or built their own, because at least I would say 40% of the houses were built by other people. And that was intentional too, to create a mix of housing, so it wasn't all by the same hand, as it were. So these innovations were complicated, but they were pretty sophisticated. And one thing I find really interesting about the houses is that when you first go there, and you mentioned that, well, can you really, what's so special about this place? Yeah, I get it feels like a nice, but the houses look kind of like, well, they're just like average houses, which indeed they do. But when you look back at how they were designed, it was all around the passive solar. So all of the angles of the roofs, the placement of the windows, the materials on the exterior, the overhangs of the eaves were all about taking advantage and living and working with the sun. And that's what drove the form of the buildings. And when you think about it like that, it's really interesting, because suddenly you think, oh, the sun is shaping these buildings. Like, that's exactly what's driving the design of them. So in terms of technology, yes, nowadays we probably wouldn't build with using those materials. In fact, those are outdated. It's always a good thing to use passive solar, right, to orientate your house north-south. But we have photovoltaics, we have other ways now of generating electricity, which would be, given the price of those nowadays, is probably more efficient and in the long term more sustainable and easier to maintain. But photovoltaics were around at that time, or at least, right, were at a price that people couldn't afford. They hadn't really hit the mainstream, and it wasn't really until the late 70s, early 80s that they even began to become available for people to be using as a residential, basis.
It's bizarre, and I'm imagining the members of the community sound like you have to have a baseline understanding of what the technology of landscape is like to really participate in this community effectively.
Yeah. Or
you just give your power away to someone else who you think knows better. But it sounds like because the community is involved in a lot of these decisions. So if someone were to approach the homeowners association tomorrow and say, I think we should really go photovoltaic or something, or can we look into everyone getting like the Tesla roof panels or something like that. Mm-hmm. Forgive me for conjuring Tesla, but you know what I mean? Like, there's a technology out there I think we would really benefit from. Do you find that the people in the general population of this community understand? Are they savvy in this regard, or are they just kind of taking what they get from here? Explain the mindset and the talent levels.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a mix, but on the whole, people do get it. I really feel that if you look around, the first residents, who bought into village homes in 1976 when the first houses were being constructed, called themselves early adopters. Like, they saw themselves as pioneers, and they quickly realized they were at the forefront of something, that they were living in a community that was not like others, that was attempting to do something that wasn't happening anywhere else. And I think that mindset is still there. I mean, the people who originally moved in, many still live in the community. Of course, they're much older now, but they still truly believe in, and many have, indeed put photovoltaics on their homes, have bought electric vehicles. So they're still looking at newer technologies and wanting to invest in them. So I'd say yes, on the whole, that definitely runs through. And I don't know if that's just because, people are selectively choosing to live there because they want to have a more sustainable lifestyle, or there's some peer pressure to some degree, right? Looking around and going, I guess I should get an electric car, or I should put photovoltaics in my house. I think it's probably a little bit of both going on in that way.
It might be the inspiration of the neighborhood itself might inspire people to want to learn more, to be more. Because another thing that I don't want to let go, I don't want to pass over in case I didn't give it its due. this community is not hippies. This is not a tent city. This is not a commune people who have gone off the grid and just re-embraced the earth or whatever. This is very much a way of living in synergy with current conditions, geopolitical conditions. These people they understand that money is not the devil or whatever. They're not walking away from exchanging money, currency for goods and services. They embrace it. Everybody needs a job, so there's not that kind of a vibe to it. The houses themselves are not tents. They're modest, yes, but they are made with a notion of commerce. There's a commercial aspect to this. Whether it be we're producing fruit, we can't consume it all. Could we sell something? And then the homes themselves, they're not cheap. I mean, I think you had mentioned before they're a few percent above market value for the neighborhood. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, what else would I be surprised by?
I mean, it's absolutely right about the price of the homes, and just interestingly, when Mike Corbett initially was selling homes in property or rather land in village homes for people to develop, a lot of some of the real estate community said, "Oh, you don't want to live there. It's never going to work. It's too much of a risk. You'll regret it. You're going to lose money." Within about 1 or 2 years, it became one of the most desirable places to live in Davis, and as a result, also the property of the land and the plots increased in price too. So yes, I mean, I think the money side. I mean, also another interesting point about the community, because you touched on it about the selling food and things too. I want to just come back to that for a minute, because when Mike and Judy envisioned village homes and the early residents there, working with them to develop how would they, what do we want to do with this place? Part of growing fruit, nuts, tending the land, growing vegetables was to sell some of that. And the almond trees that are on Arlington Boulevard, which is just outside of village homes there, were a cash crop, essentially. Like, they would be harvested every year and sold, to raise money for the community, to put back into the community, for maintenance and for building other things. There was also vineyards. The idea was that they would harvest the grapes, they would make wine and sell that too. So there's always been a kind of more entrepreneurial side to it. And another feature that's quite unusual about village homes, indeed at the time, is a commercial district called Plumshire. So Mike envisioned that there would be a place where you would also rent out apartments, there would be a restaurant, there would be commercial properties for people to have, offices for people to have their businesses in. And the money that would be made from rents and from those would then go back into the community. That was a tough sell at the time. And it still is, really, because an HOA shouldn't be really making money in that way. And it took a lot of legal ways to make that kind of work. And Plumshire, it's its own operating system. It's not part of the Village Homeowners Association. So I think this just goes back to that Mike was always realistic about building this. That, again, it was not about, leaving the world behind and living as cheaply and as simply as possible. This was based in reality, in realism, that we want to build something, but we need to be able to maintain it in the long run, and therefore be realistic about how we generate income to make this work. And, that to me goes back to this developing it in a grown-up kind of way, like taking the best of, sort of back to the land principles, of a community-based organization, but also realizing that, we're living in a world where we need money to survive. Like, you can't, that's still going to be an important part of it.
Yeah, it's a very pragmatic approach to idealism.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it says a lot about Mike as an individual who is kind of, a very interesting person in the sense that his background is in farming on one side, and his other side is more in entrepreneurship and property. So it's almost like this mix coming together of like, oh yeah, we can have a bit of both of those, and I think it comes through in his vision in some ways of that's exactly what it was about.
His brain hemispheres must have battled left and right.
I think they did, very much so.
Well, what a wonderful battle to have. So, Village Homes, has it, to your knowledge, has it served as a model for other communities? Have you seen others that have kind of emulated the structure here?
It certainly is inspirational for many places. I mean, there are places, that have cited Village Homes as, or people who have visited certainly to learn things from it. And this is always one of the big questions that gets asked is, okay, if Village Homes is so wonderful, why aren't there more of them? And it's a great question, right? Why don't we have more communities like that? And I'd say, well, we could have. There's nothing stopping us from doing it. But what makes it challenging is the level of that Village Homes took it to, so that we have so many things going on, from the energy efficiency in terms of housing and the passive solar, the water reclamation, and the idea of retaining water on the land and making sure that's all kept there, the idea of having an edible landscape. Again, climate makes a big difference, right? You can't do that everywhere, where you can grow food all year round, essentially, so that's always part of it too. The idea of a community, of having community spaces and really actively getting people to participate in that, or creating an infrastructure or a way that people can come together. I mean, Judy talks a lot about that the common areas are the place where people to come together, but you need a reason to come together as well. And that might be, I just want to meet my neighbors, or we want to share food together, or we want to have a party, or we want our kids to hang out. So these are all aspects that Village Homes does really well, but it's kind of, then you employ well over 70 acres and nearly 250 houses on a big scale, on a fairly large scale as well. That's what makes it pretty unique, and that's what makes it radical, because nowhere else has really managed to maintain all of those things and on that scale. There are certainly places who have taken parts of what's at Village Homes and incorporated them into their communities with mixed success, and some with success. And, I look for why do we care about this community? Why is it important? Why does it matter to Davis? Because I think Davis should be incredibly proud of what it nurtured and made happen. But it does go back to just the scale of it. And a lot of it is about this sense of interconnectedness of how things really, it's a system. Everything, if you look at it, connects to another. Like the water grows the food, people eat the food, that pays for other things. The community comes together, they help tend the land. Like everything, if you look at it, is interconnected. And that's often how things work the best, right? When everything is benefiting each other. And that, I think, works really well at Village Homes too. But part of it is also, how do you sustain that? And, you mentioned about changes in the community over time. There have been ups and downs in community involvement, where we're seeing at the moment what some people are calling kind of a renaissance in the community, of people wanting to get back involved in things in a big way. But there was times when it had a lull and people were less interested, maybe because they were busy doing other things. They had, time was there. But how do you sustain that too is a really important thing. And that I always think is part of its uniqueness, that it's been successful over that period of over 50 years in that sense.
And that 50 years, that is a pretty outstanding achievement. Congratulations on that. And
I didn't have anything to do with that.
Well, you, as a resident, I'm thinking you prop up at least your corner of the homes. And also, you are curating an exhibit around the celebration of the 50-year anniversary?
Yeah. So in my capacity as the director and chief curator of the UC Davis Design Museum, we're doing an exhibition to commemorate 50 years of Village Homes. The exhibition's called Village Homes, A Radical Plan, going back to this radical idea of this community and what it represents. And it will feature a short 30-minute documentary film. There'll be a tabletop scale model map of the community, where we have projected overlays showing how everything works. There is a partial reconstruction of a house to show the passive solar features that that are there as well. So for me, it's been a lot of fun to think about how do you turn a concept like village homes into an exhibition that isn't just about reading stuff or watching stuff, but physically tactile, because it's a tactile, multisensorial space. How do we capture some of that energy? It's the first time there's ever been an exhibition about this community. There have been short films, there have been books written about it, but we've never done an exhibition before. So this is, it has been an amazing project actually, and has been a catalyst for a lot of other things where, we've been able to gather a lot of archival material and interviews with some of the first residents and with the founders, Michael and Judy Corbett, to preserve their voices as oral histories too, which is important so that we get their story captured for the future as well.
Yeah, I have to think their perspectives are fairly unique because the community just does such a great job of straddling all these lines, and it's a very holistic view. It's not, I'm not pure hippie, I'm not pure capitalist, I'm somewhere between the middle, but I think it's fantastic. And what are the dates of the show?
So the exhibition opens on January the 20th, 2026, and runs through April 26th. So and then on February the 21st, there is an open house at the Design Museum here on campus. It coincides with the campus's Biodiversity Museum Day, where the museum will be open. We'll also have a screening of the documentary film. There'll also be a kind of panel discussion about village homes, but more importantly about what village homes represents for the future. Because as we think about our current climate crisis, housing, a sense of well-being, all these questions, village homes has been tackling them really for 50 years. They're issues that were pertinent then and they still are today. So in some ways, we always think that we're living in Mike and Judy's future, and indeed we are, and it's still continuing. And many of those, those issues haven't gone away. They're still very real and present.
I have one final question for you, and I promise I will not judge you on your answer, but it's a nonsense question. But I've heard it said that frustration is what happens when your expectations don't align with reality. And I think a lot of people's expectations are that life is about them. It's not necessarily a symbiotic game. In reality, life is very symbiotic. We require each other. We require a communal component. That seems to be mastered here. Do you find that people in this community are generally happier, less frustrated than people without, who are trying to battle that? No, it's me.
Yeah, I do. I think there's a general sense of, I walk around that community every morning and I see people I know. I maybe stop having a conversation, I wave to them, but I feel like I'm really connected to that neighborhood and I know the people who live there. It doesn't mean to say I have to talk to everybody, but I just know they're there, and that makes me happy. That makes me feel like I belong, I think, to something much bigger. And, that's, I think, what many of us are seeking. There's a great quote from one of the residents who talks about village homes being about the land, because it really is, right? We're on ag land. Here in Davis, agriculture is an important thing, and village homes couldn't really have happened without having, land that lended itself to food production, right? Because that's such a big part of it. So I think land's an important part of that. And if you think about the two very important things in life, our sense of where we are and our belonging, but also our sense of people in our community, are the two things we really kind of crave the most. And I think Village Homes brings those together in a very successful way. Outstanding.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today, and I look forward to the exhibition. And where do I sign up to get on the list?
Yeah, no, thanks, Ed. Thanks for the great conversation. Enjoyed talking to you about it.
Sincerest thanks to today's guest, Tim McNeil. If you'd like to learn more about Tim and his work, check out our YouTube page for links to his bio, books, articles, research, and more. And thank you for joining Minds Over Matters today. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Please subscribe, share with your friends, and spread the word. We have a lot to say, and we guarantee something for everyone. Minds Over Matters is hosted by Ed Kiggins, produced by the College of Letters and Science at UC Davis, and filmed at the Wyatt Pavilion. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.